Okay, it should be recording now, I believe. Yeah. Interesting. It doesn't do that recording in progress um, alert anymore. I guess, like I said, it's a new update. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen now, so that way we can take a look at the chapter here. Okay, so you all should be able to see chapter 2, right? The PowerPoint for chapter 2. So let me go ahead and uh, expand it here a bit. Let me make it larger. Okay, perfect. Okay, there you go. Okay, so you all should be able to see chapter 2 here. All right. So let me go ahead and hide the yeah. I'll go ahead and hide the. Okay. So chapter 2 here is titled "The Constitutional Setting." So what we're going to be focusing on here within this chapter is we're going to be taking a look at the Texas Constitution. And if you've had a chance to ever look at the Texas Constitution, I do have it uploaded in the resources, which, as I've said to y'all before, let me just also reiterate that the links that I have in the resources, you do not have to click on all of them. You do not have to watch everything or access everything. Those are just there in case you want to access them, right? In case you have a desire to, to read through some more of this stuff or go back and watch some of these additional videos to help with your studying, you're more than welcome to do so, and that's why all that's there. But just as a note, you don't have to click on everything, because I know I have like a lot of links in the chapter resources, and so I know it can be a little bit overwhelming. So I just wanted to just reiterate that it's not necessary to click on everything, but it's there if you all need to. Okay, so just want to just reiterate that. Okay, so as we were talking about here in chapter 2, the constitutional setting, we are going to take a look at the Texas Constitution. We're going to also do a comparing and contrasting between the Texas Constitution and the US Constitution in terms of its layout, in terms of the way it's structured, a little bit of the content as well. The Texas Constitution is extremely lengthy. So when I cover the US Constitution in Government 2305, I do take some time for us to go over, the actual Constitution, right? And we do have Constitution Day coming up next week. But to actually go over the Constitution, go over the different articles and the sections within the articles, and we can usually knock that out in the class period because the U.S. Constitution is rather short. The Texas Constitution, forget about it. It would probably take us a month to go through the whole thing, uh, article and by article, section by section. It would take us forever. So we're not going to have time to be able to actually delve into it. I'm sure there's a grad school class where they actually do that. But here we're just going to give a broad overview of it, and we're going to do more of a comparing and contrasting between the two types of constitutions. So that's kind of in a nutshell the main emphasis that we're going to be working on here within chapter 2. Let's take a look at the objectives here really quickly. So not just what I just mentioned, but we're also going to take a look at some more democratic theory here. So by the end of this chapter, you should be able to understand the nature of federal systems of government. So we're going to take a look at federalism. We touched on federalism a little bit in chapter 1, but we're going to delve into it a little bit more into detail. If you've taken Government 2305, there's a whole chapter devoted to federalism. That's usually chapter 3 in Government 2305. So it's going to be kind of like a review if you've taken Government 2305, which is, again, why I've always suggested for students to, like I said on the first day, right, I've always believed that the best way to, to succeed in Government 2306 is either to have taken Government 2305 already or take it concurrently. That also is, I would also say that's also good. But again, it is what it is. I mean, it's you all's degree plan. It's you all's, it's you all's journey in terms of completing your classes. So I'm not going to tell you okay, you have to do it this way if it's not required. But just as a personal recommendation, I would definitely say that taking Government 2305 is definitely helps a lot more. But it is what it is. But yeah, so we're going to take a look at we're going to delve into federal systems of government. Like I said, not as much as we would in 2305, but I will give you all the the basics of it. And like I said, if some of y'all have taken it before, then it'll be a review. Understand the purposes of constitutions as well as the extent to which these are reflected in the Texas Constitution. So we're going to take a look at why do we need constitutions? What are they supposed to do? Why are they important? Those are very important. Those are very key questions in terms of analyzing what constitutions are and why we have them. And I think it's probably pretty common knowledge that they're probably there for a reason, right? Now, of course, some people have disagreements about the scope of constitutions, what's in a constitution, and how much should be in one. But the fact that having a set of rules and guidelines that a country and by extension a society within a country is supposed to follow, and I do use the in quotations supposed to, that of course is something that I think a lot of us would say is important. Now, again, the details is where people have some disagreements on in terms of what should be in there and how much of it should be in there. But again, that's more of another topic here. But we are going to discuss why we have constitutions and what their purposes are. Okay, next one. Explain how the rights written into constitutions and other rights assumed but not written sometimes conflict with one another, and how those conflicts have recently emerged in Texas politics. Yes, we are going to take a look at how that, especially when we look at the way our federal constitution is written, how it's very short, it's not that specific, it's broad and open to a lot of interpretation. That's why we have numerous laws passed by Congress that are supposed to act within the scope of what is written in the Constitution. And again, and if you've taken Government 2305, you'll know that because the Constitution is so broad and open to interpretation, and that was done on purpose, right? The framers felt that you don't want to have a Constitution that is so specific and so wordy and detailed that the legislative branch can't really do anything. It's almost like, you might not, one of the, if not the main responsibilities of a legislative branch is the lawmaking aspect, right? To pass laws. We'll definitely talk about that later on when we get to the legislative chapter. And we are going to touch on that a little bit also here in this chapter. But the point is that when you have a broad constitution, that gives the legislative branch, it gives them more flexibility, more authority to be able to kind of fill in the gap, so to speak. But when you have a very stringent, specific constitution, then the legislature, they kind of have their hands tied because they're not able to actually really go in there and deviate too much from what's already in there. And that's also why if you are like a state rep here in Texas, you're going to have to do a lot of studying and a lot of reading in that Constitution, because you have to know what is allowed and what isn't. And because it's a much longer document, it definitely requires a lot more thinking and a lot more studying to make sure that whatever bill you introduce, that it does fall in line with both the U.S. Constitution. That's the easy part, but the Texas Constitution is a lot more difficult. But anyway, but continuing with this objective here, we are going to talk about how that because there is a lot of this, broad interpretation of our U.S. Constitution, it does make it more likely that there's going to be disagreements because the Constitution isn't so specific. There's going to be disagreements at the federal level, there's disagreements, among the different branches of government. Like you've probably seen in the last, several years, if you've been paying attention to politics, how that the president and the Congress will always be disagreeing about things, and they'll be citing the Constitution to make, they'll both say the Constitution's on their side, even though they're opposing sides. And so you might think to yourself, well, how is that possible? And I don't want to delve too much into, I don't want to act like a Supreme Court justice here and decide constitutionally whether, which of these sides are right or wrong here. But the point that I'm saying is that because the Constitution is so broad, that it allows for these different governmental groups to make competing arguments as to why their viewpoint is constitutional and the other one isn't. And we also see this type of constitutional disagreement happen between the federal government and states, especially Texas. We're seeing it play out right now, as I've referenced before, with the whole border security issue that's going on here in Texas along the border. The Constitution, the federal government would say that the Constitution is straightforward, that the securing of the border is strictly a federal issue. But as we've talked about before, what happens if a state that also shares an international border, what if the state doesn't agree with the job the federal government is doing? What if they don't think the federal government is doing a good enough job? Does the state then have the authority to then step in and assist? You see, the Constitution does say that when we look at Article 1, Section 8, that the rule of naturalization, which is what we call immigration today, that is a responsibility for Congress. So it's a federal responsibility, and then the executive branch, which is supposed to execute the laws of Congress, they're responsible for enforcing the law. So you would think that that's very straightforward, but again, this isn't. But if you're just looking at this from a logical perspective, you could make an argument that, yeah, maybe Texas has a point here. So it's good. We're gonna have to see how the courts rule on this, and things like that. So that's an interesting example for this objective here. And we'll talk again. We will discuss this ad nauseum throughout this entire class because it is very interesting, and it's something that I've really never seen before. I've never seen a state and the federal government really not just disagree on border security policy, but actually having the actual federal agents versus the state agents actually engage in actual disagreements on the ground, so to speak, where the state wasn't letting Border Patrol access certain areas. I've never seen that before, which again, we'll talk more about that here as we continue along. Describe the history of Texas Constitution. So we're going to do a breakdown of the different constitutions that Texas has seen throughout its history, not just as a member of the United States, but also back when it was part of Mexico, and then also when it was own independent republic. So we'll touch on this next time. So we'll get into this next time here. Then discuss the key aspects of the present Texas Constitution. Like I said, it would take forever for us to go through the entire Texas Constitution article by article. So we're just going to give it just a broad overview. But it is there if you ever want to kind of read through it and see see what's in there. But we will discuss a lot of the similarities and differences between the Texas Constitution and the U.S. Constitution. That's basically, in a nutshell, what we're going to be spending the bulk of our time when we're looking at the Texas Constitution, is comparing it to the U.S. Constitution. What are the similarities and the differences? Because there are lots of similarities in there. There's similarities when it comes to the branches of government. Like in Texas, we have the same three branches of government that we have at the federal level, right? So at the federal level, we have the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. We have those same types of branches in Texas. We do have a state legislature. We do have the state executive, and we do have state courts. However, though, we are going to see that there are some differences when we compare the Texas branch of government to the federal branch of government. So we will delve more into those examples here as we continue with this chapter, and as well as in the course here. So that is a key. That is one of the key themes that we will be looking at within this course, is comparing Texas government to the federal government and vice versa, and seeing the similarities and the differences. So I gave you some similarities. One key difference that we will take a look at is that in Texas, judges are not appointed by the executive and confirmed by the state Senate. Instead, judges are elected in Texas. So you see how that is a major difference when we compare Texas to the federal government. Yes, we have judges here in Texas, just like at the national level, but the way those judges get their jobs is starkly different than what we see at the federal level. So that's one example of a key difference between Texas government and the federal government. Analyze the need for and the politics behind constitutional change. So we will also take a look at some of the logistical issues that we have within the Texas Constitution. Like one example is that state representatives and state senators, they get paid peanuts compared to what their federal and even other fellow state counterparts get, in that members of Congress make about $175,000 a year, whereas state reps and state senators make $7,000. So not even close to. And I'm not saying $7,000 per month. I'm saying $7,000 per year. Now we'll talk about how they also get per diems, when they're in session and all this and that, but in terms of the actual paycheck that they get from the state, it's minuscule. And that, of course, is a leftover. It's almost like it's not almost. It's pretty much that it's like this is what people were getting paid, back in back in the turn of the 20th century or something like that. But it just never updated. It never kept up with inflation, type of thing, right? So we'll talk about what are some of the issues that arise from not paying your legislators hardly anything here. That'll be more so for the legislative chapter, but I wanted to give you an example of how the Texas Constitution has pretty much kind of stayed back in the 1800s, when we had the 1876 state constitution, which is the one which is the constitution that we still abide by today. And of course, we're gonna delve into a little bit of the history of that. We did talk about E.J. Davis and the Radical Republicans in Chapter 1, but we will talk more about how the Texas Democrats not only disagreed with the Radical Republicans, but they pretty much hated them so much that they decided to get as far away from the way that the Texas government, the way the Radical Republicans had crafted Texas government. They wanted to get as far away from that as possible. And if that doesn't sound familiar to you, for you all, if you studied U.S. history, another comparison to the American Revolution in terms of the U.S. Constitution, that arose from that, right? This idea of limiting government and wanting to get away from a strong centralized government, like they saw with over there in England. We see that also here with Texas. So a lot of similarities between, like I said, between Texas and the early days of the United States here. So okay, let's go ahead and continue here. All right, so let's talk about American federalism here. Let me just take another drink of water here. All right, so let's discuss American federalism here. Like we said, we're not gonna devote a whole class period to it. So this is just going to be kind of like a brief overview of it. Now, when we look at this idea of American federalism, first off, of course, we have to understand what federalism is. And as I've said to you all many times before, that this usually is one of the most difficult concepts within studies of American/Texas government. In fact, it's such a it is such a I mean, okay, so in me personally, it's not that difficult, but it's something that apparently students have had issues with in terms of understanding the conceptualization of it, because I do understand that it is rather abstract and you kind of have to like really think about it. So it can be a little bit confusing. So much so that when I've had interviews at other colleges, like they'll even like that's usually the question that they'll ask me. Like they'll ask me like, okay, like do a lesson on federalism. So my theory is that it's because it's looked at as one of the most troublesome subjects, and I've seen that, in all the years that I've taught it, I have seen that federalism does give my students the most problems. So I definitely try my best to try to explain it as best as possible. So let's go ahead and kind of discuss this here, and then that's going to lead us into these different types of federalism. So federalism in general is this idea that you don't have the federal government controlling everything. And I know some other people will say it like much more eloquently, like sovereignty and all that stuff, But again, I like to explain things in a more down to earth type of way for, because my job as an educator is to get for people to understand abstract, complex concepts, but in a way that the average person can understand. So I definitely try to explain it in more practical terms. So, but yeah, so the way I would describe federalism is you've got the federal government and the state governments, and both of them have their own distinct responsibilities within government, right? Because when we think of government, most people tend to think, well, like they think of like the president or whatever, Congress, but that's not the only levels of government that have responsibilities within our everyday lives. In fact, if you really think about it, the president really doesn't have that much direct influence on the everyday issues of government that we face in society. In fact, you can make an argument that local government actually has more of an impact when it comes to like property tax assessments, how much you're going to pay in those property taxes every year. That's definitely something that's handled at the local level. So that's something that we're definitely going to feel a lot more than maybe, some executive order decision reorganizing some archaic federal executive agency or something like that. Maybe there's an executive order about like how to call in sick or something like that. I'm just giving you just a very, very outlandish example. But my point is that within federalism, you have the federal government that has their unique responsibilities, and then you have the state that has their unique responsibilities, which again would be called sovereignty. So this creates a system where the federal government is not going to tell the states what to do for certain areas. And this leads us to the 10th Amendment, which is the reserve clause, right? Because the 10th Amendment of the US Constitution says that all powers not delegated specifically to the federal government are supposed to automatically default to the states. I'm just giving you just I'm just giving a summary of it, right? Paraphrasing it. So what this means here is that whatever is in the Constitution in terms of powers that belong to the federal government, that's what they're responsible for. And then anything that's left off the US Constitution, it's supposed to belong to the states. Now, this is a very important power because if you think about this, this means that like 1,000 years from now, if the US government is still around, hopefully so, but with climate change and all that stuff, you never know. But the point is that let's say hypothetically, let's say that, the United States is still around by then. Um, you could have new rights that have been thought of that we had that hadn't come to our mind, or new responsibilities of government. Like let's say like 500 years from now, government is responsible for, I don't know, like let's say they need to, I don't know, what would be something. I mean, it's hard to think, 500 years from now. Let's say there's like a new species of animal that's discovered or something like that, and so then they have to be protected or something like that. So that responsibility under the reserve clause would fall to the states. So anything in the future, any new responsibilities of government would fall to the states. This is why education is a good example of this, because back when the US Constitution was written, education was not a government responsibility. Education was basically just a private affair because there was no public education back in the late 1700s. Even into the 1800s, there was no public education. It was all private school. So education was a privilege that people had. That's why most people in America were not educated. However, we decided in the 20th century that education is important enough that government needs to get involved in it and government needs to fund it. So now we have public education. So you see how that's a new responsibility of government that government wasn't responsible for 200 something years ago. So because of the reserve clause here within the 10th Amendment, it's not a surprise that the states are the levels of government that are responsible for education for the most part, right? So you see how that makes sense, that anything new that comes up is going to automatically default to the states. Now, what's also important about this is that, remember how I said that the US Constitution is very broad and doesn't have much to it? So because there's not much to the US Constitution, that's also why if you look at and there's a good crash course video that talks about this, that goes more detail on this. If you look at the listing of the different powers that if you compare like the US, the powers that the federal government has compared to the states, you'll see that the states has a lot more number of powers. So the powers that the federal government has, they're mostly powers that are like, let me give a description in terms of what kinds of powers they're. They're powers that deal with either international affairs, either foreign policy, whether it's trading or enforcing borders, like we talked about before, even though there's some disagreement on that, or also issues that affect all the states or different states. So interstate affairs also is handled by the federal government. And so let's kind of break those two down, right? Because so foreign policy, again, states cannot enter into foreign policy agreements or treaties with other countries because they are not allowed to make decisions on, they can't make decisions for other states, right? It's the same reason why if, let's say, Texas and New Mexico are engaging in a dispute about water from the Rio Grande, Texas can't tell New Mexico what to do because they're on the same level, right? They're equal, right? They're both states. So that's where the federal government would have to step in because the federal government is representative of all 50 states, right? So you could kind of look at it as like a step above, so to speak, when it comes to being a referee for these different, for disagreements between states. Does that kind of make sense? And then again, issues dealing with other countries, right? Those are the types of issues that the federal government is responsible for. So everything else, like issues within a state, that's going to be handled by the state government. So this is where you see things like, crime and the penal code. That's going to be handled by state. So if you're arrested, you're going to, you will have violated a state law, right? That's why if let's say you've been arrested and you're going to go before a judge, the court docket is going to say people of the state of Texas versus, and then it's going to have your name. because, and this goes back to a little bit of my criminal justice training, that when you've committed a crime, you have, if you've committed a crime, the idea is that you have committed an offense that is so offensive to the rest of the state society that you need to be held accountable for it, right? So any of these types of crimes, especially these really, these index crimes, these really, these felony crimes, yeah, that's definitely going to be very offensive to the general public. And so that's why, so again, I'm explaining that crimes are considered um, state law, right? And same thing like with education or with licensing. If you're trying to pretty much any prestigious job nowadays requires some sort of certification or license or something. Like let's say you wanted to be a teacher, you would have to get a state certification through the Texas Education Agency, and then the State Board of Education. They approve it and all that stuff. So you have to get all these different certificates, whether it's like to be a teacher, librarian, principal, stuff like that. There's all these certifications that you need to get in order to, and of course also the college education that goes with it. But you also need to pass these tests in order to be certified. So yeah, so those are issues that are handled at the state. Now, what I just described also is more the type of federalism that we saw under dual federalism, which was the layer cake federalism, where state and national governments operate independently from one another. So this is where you have that clear separation between what the federal government is doing and what the states are doing. So I like to compare dual federalism to, like, let's say you have a neighbor that you don't talk to at all. And so, yes, they're next to you and you have that fence, but you have no interaction with them at all. You have no relationship. They're doing their thing in their house and you're doing your thing over here. That's kind of like what I like to compare dual federalism to. So I like to use a lot of analogies here. So, right. And this is the type of federalism that we saw traditionally from the start of our federal system, or federalist system, sorry, from the late 1700s all the way until the Great Depression. So during this time, we had that strict separation where the national government was just basically off in Washington doing their own thing. And like I said, just handling more so international and interstate issues such as, the postal service, running the postal service, as well as coining money, and also the patents, also because all of those aspects affect the states, right? So the mail goes through all the states. Money has to go to all the states, right? You can't have one state having its own money and other states having other monies. That was one of the issues during the Articles of Confederation time period. So, right, so you have to make sure that the money is the same, as well as the patents, right? You can't have, copyright and patents and things like that, right? You can't have someone, you can't have like your invention being legal over here in your state, but then someone else just ripped you off and then is making money off of it in another part of the country, right? So you have to make sure that all that's uniform, right? And we do see also that there is more uniformity. At least they try to have more uniformity throughout the U.S. Constitution, such as full faith and credit clause, privileges and immunities. Again, that's more so for government 2035 here. But again, just giving you all some examples of how dual federalism tried to make that clear separation between the national government and the state. So in actuality, back during the 1800s, you really didn't see too much federal government involvement, at the state or local levels. In fact, it was very rare that you would ever run into anybody working for the federal government other than like your local post office and things like that. And even today, it's still kind of like that. Of course, we're a little bit different because we live along the border, so we do see a lot more federal activity here. But like I've said before, if you go like to Kansas or something like that, probably the only federal employees you'll probably run into are either post office people or like agriculture people, like the USDA, representatives, and things like that. So very little real federal interaction. It's mostly state and local levels. But now let's move on to cooperative federalism, which is the marble cake, right? So the layer cake, of course, also the analogy is that in a layer cake, you just like the layers of cake are separate, right? Like, the separate flavors, like let's say you want to, put like, one layer of cake is strawberry and then on top of it is like a chocolate cake. And so the strawberry and the chocolate don't interact with each other, right? They're their own separate layers on top of each other. Whereas marble cake, you bake like let's say it's like a vanilla and a strawberry, you bake it all into the cake. So even if, let's say, there's two levels to it, the chocolate or sorry, the strawberry and the vanilla, they're baked together, and so you really can't separate the two from the two layers of cake. So that's the cooperative federalism. which is an emphasis on cooperation and collective interaction between states and the nation. So we saw the rise of cooperative federalism occurring during the Great Depression and the New Deal policies put forth by FDR's administration, which was aimed to try to, to assist with what was going on during the Great Depression. So if you all are familiar with U.S. history, you'll definitely understand that the Great Depression, and we've had a couple of other economic downturns like the Great Recession in 2008, and then also the COVID shutdown of 2020. We've seen several of these severe economic downturns, but the Great Depression was the worst of them as a result of the stock market crash of 1929. And you probably have, if you've studied U.S. history, you'll know about this, right? This is one of the major hallmarks of American history. You've probably seen the pictures of the people there in New York and lines at the soup kitchen, because this was the epicenter of this depression, right? Where people, who had invested in the stock market just lost everything overnight, right? It was just that. And what also is not talked about as much, though, is that the U.S. Depression also affected other parts of the world. The Great Depression also affected Europe and Germany, right? Germany, which have been dealing with severe economic downturn after World War I, and the terms and conditions that have been put forth on during the Treaty of Versailles. They still were dealing with severe inflation, and so they unfortunately also were affected by the Great Depression. And so the reason why I mention that is because that also was one of the factors in terms of the rise of Nazism there in Germany and all that stuff, because of people just were so desperate they weren't able to eat. So sadly they ended up turning to to the Nazis and all that stuff. And so just wanted to make that quick historical footnote, I guess you could say, that the Depression also affected other parts of the world, not just the United States. But anyway, so FDR, he gets elected, and what he does is that he decides that he is going to transform the way the federal government operates. Because up until this point, the federal government was not involved in these types of affairs, right? Where when the Depression hit, the federal government could not do anything to assist what people were going through. Instead, it was the responsibility of state, local governments, local charities, churches. That was the social safety net at the time. There was no like SNAP programs like food stamps. There was no disability checks. There was no TANF, welfare. None of that was going on. It wasn't until FDR's administration came in and said, no, the federal government has to respond because this is an emergency. The states and local governments are too overwhelmed. They don't have the money that the federal government does, which had also been the federal government was also gaining money because of the introduction of the income tax that had happened a couple of years beforehand. So that's when Americans started to had to file income taxes, which was able to fund taxes for the for the federal government. So with the federal government having more money now compared to the states, the federal government stepped in and created a lot of these work programs, like the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps, the alphabet soup, as they like to call it, the alphabet soup of these government agencies and programs. And these programs were meant as a way to get people to work. Like the federal government was thinking of ways to get jobs to people, to get them, to get them out of, to get money into their pockets, and of course for them, to earn that money, to be able to work. And so a lot of these organizations, what they did, I'm sorry, a lot of these agencies, what they did was that they engaged in, beautification projects, like beautifying national parks, also building infrastructure, building roads and bridges. The Tennessee Valley Authority was another great example of providing electricity to areas in the rural South that didn't have electricity still at the time. Even again, it just not everyone had electricity, not even 100 years ago in the United States. So there's been a lot of technology advances, in that 100 years since then. But my point is that that's so cooperative federalism is where the federal government and the states work together to try to solve these common problems. And normally the way this is done is where the federal government will provide funding to the states in the form of different types of grants, like block grants, categorical grants, all different types of grants. And so, like I mentioned right now, how the states don't have the kind of money that the federal government has. So the states, what they'll do is that they will end up taking this federal money, but in exchange with a lot of these grants, the federal government also is going to put forth certain conditions. It's no different than, like, let's say you get a loan at a bank, right? Um, if the bank's going to lend you money, you can't just, can't just not pay it back, right? Or you can't just decide when you're going to pay it back, right? The bank has certain terms, right? The bank will put forth, the date, the payment date. They'll also put forth like the interest that you're going to pay on this loan. So there's a lot of stuff that goes in there. So the federal government's no different. The federal government is going to put restrictions such as how the money is going to be used. Also, what state and local governments have to do when they get federal government grants is they also have to put forth, like the grant writing process is kind of interesting, right? You have to put forth a proposal for the grant. If the grant gets approved, then you have to submit documentation showing how you're spending the money. So an example would be like, let's say, because there have been some federal grants in more recent years where the federal government has provided money to local police departments so that they can so they can get body cameras for their officers. So the person in charge of overseeing the grant has to document, like an example would be like, let's say they have to put forth a report like, okay, how many cameras did they order? Let's say there's 20 cameras that were ordered, which officers got the cameras, how are the cameras maintained, all that really technical stuff that, to send back to the federal government to show, hey, we are spending the money exactly the way that the grant said it needed to be spent, because the grants will also be very specific in terms of how the money needs to be spent. So I know I'm just kind of going off into a tangent here, but again, so this is marble cake federalism, where the federal and state governments will work together to solve common problems, and it's usually the federal government that foots most of the money here, right? There's also what's called picket fence federalism. This is more of a more recent term. This is a variant of cooperative federalism in which all levels of government are involved in policymaking and implementation. Local levels, bureaucracies, interest groups. You see, let me also give you an example of picket fence federalism. So you tend to see picket fence federalism a lot when you have natural disasters. I mean, I just talked about how, like, there's a hurricane in the Gulf, like, just offshore here. So when it comes to natural disasters, you do see the different levels of government working together. You'll see, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management. You will see, like state, like for Texas, it would be, like DPS, because they also have their own emergency management team within DPS. You also see county governments where they have their emergency preparedness plans and all that, and then you have also cities, right? Local governments. Well, so they'll all work together to. So the way it happens in, like, say, like I'll give you an example, like for the hurricanes, right? So with the hurricanes, the way they do is, obviously, of course, you have like the National Hurricane Center under NOAA, and then they, of course, are responsible for tracking hurricanes, forecasting for them. You also have the hurricane hunters who are stationed in Mobile, Alabama. They're part of the military, and they go fly into the to the storms, and they're able to bring back atmospheric data such as barometric pressure, the millibars, and wind speeds and all that stuff, and they measure all that stuff, and then they report back to the National Hurricane Center. So, to assist the National Hurricane Center with that data, so then they can craft the computer simulations to predict where the hurricanes are going to go. It's very interesting how they do this. So that information then, of course, gets disseminated back to the governments, to not just to the federal governments, but also to the state and local governments, and then they make their plans to issue evacuation orders, like what's going on in Louisiana right now. And then, of course, they'll also coordinate the logistics of, getting, because obviously, of course, with a hurricane, power is going to be knocked out. You saw what happened with Hurricane Beryl this past summer over in Houston. They were without power for at least a couple of weeks, at least 2 weeks, in some places. So they also have to coordinate with power companies. And I know I actually spent some time in Houston about a week after Beryl hit, and yeah, there was a bunch of these, the electrical trucks, right, to go and reconnect the power wires and all that stuff. So a bunch of those trucks, and some of them were coming over from Louisiana. So I know Texas is definitely going to do the same thing. where they will then return the favor and they will send their trucks over to Louisiana after what happens here with the hurricane. So so they do all that coordinating, and then after the storm passes, then they have to engage in cleanup, right? And so, like I said, they have to restore the power, but they have to engage in cleanup efforts, to cut through trees if trees fall in roads, and they have to clear that out. Picket fence federalism also involves the private sector too. So they'll also send other organizations like the Red Cross will go over there to assist with medical with injuries and try to assist people's medical needs. You'll also have grocery places like HEB that will go and send food to these locations. Other places, like Chick-fil-A, Whataburger, so even the private sector also helps out in these times of emergency. So that's in a nutshell kind of what picket fence federalism is. So, okay. Let's go ahead and move on here really quickly here. I know we're already, let's see, we got about 15 minutes left. So let's see how much more we can cover here. Okay. I do want to talk about Obamacare, but let me see. Let's see if we can come back to it, and then I want to see how much more we have. Yeah, we have. Let's take a look at the legitimacy here first, and then we'll come back to Obamacare. Okay. So let's take a look at the purposes of constitutions. Okay. So when we look at this idea of legitimacy is extremely important when we're trying to analyze, why we have constitutions in the first place. What is their need? Why are they here? When we look at legitimacy, the definition here for legitimacy is when the people govern accept its government acts as moral, fair, and just, and thus believe they should obey its laws. Legitimacy is an extremely important aspect of constitutions. It goes back to some of these Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke, where they discussed this, this idea of social contract theory. Social contract theory is, and I'm definitely a big proponent of it. I definitely do believe in this idea of social contract theory, which I think we discussed it before, but we'll talk about it again here as a refresher. That social contract theory is this idea that if we are in a society, and as our society gets larger, we decide as a society that we're going to need certain rules to abide by, because we can't just rely on the honor system for people to just behave themselves, because there's just too many people. And sadly, and I've seen this, unfortunately, people kind of, I don't want to get into a philosophical debate about human nature, but it's definitely, I've definitely seen where people, in my personal experience, people do tend to be selfish, and they do tend to, they do want to go for their self-interest first. So what you have to do is, when you have, because you can't just have everyone being selfish, because then that's gonna cause situations where, is it just going to be like the strong survive, right? Or, are just some people going to get things, but then other people who are not as able to get things, are they not going to be able to? So my point is that you have to have a set of rules that people have to follow, and then you also have to have consequences and sanctions for people violating those rules. Because, like I said, if we didn't have like the criminal code, then people would just do whatever they wanted, right? People, it'd be like The Purge. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie where they make it legal, like where people can go and like commit crimes for like 24 hours, something like that. It's kind of interesting, but it's not every person for themselves, right? Because if that was the case, then what's the point of like paying taxes on a government, right? If the government's not really gonna go and provide us with services or with help, right? That's the essence of social contract theory, where we're willing to give up some, I know people say rights, but I guess it's more like some people would give up, the ability to do certain things in exchange for more protection and more equity within our government, right? So we give up the ability to basically do whatever we want, so that we have more, more order, more fairness within our government. So that's in essence what social contract theory, and that goes to the legitimacy, right? Where if people believe that the government's decisions are in the best interests of the people, if they believe that what the government is doing is is right and just and fair, like it's saying here, then people are going to obey those laws. But what happens if people don't believe that the government is being fair and just and moral? It's going to be a lot harder for people to just follow what the government is doing, right? And we've seen how that there are consequences of this illegitimacy, where, again, going back to the American Revolution, right? And then we'll also talk about the Texas Revolution here in a bit. Like I said, both of them are very similar. In the American Revolution, the colonists did not believe in legitimacy of the British government because the colonists did not believe that they were being adequately represented in Parliament, right? The no taxation without representation, right? They did not believe that the British government was making decisions with the appropriate amount of input and fairness with respect to what the colonists were going through. The colonists felt that they were second-class citizens in the British Empire. And then a very similar thing also happened in Texas, where, as we talked about last week, right, where Santa Anna, he consolidated power within the Mexican government, and the 1830 law, which basically cut off continued immigration into Texas, and could join the state of Coahuila with Texas, and so the Texans had to go all the way to Saltillo, to get stuff done, and so the the Americans that were coming over to Texas felt that that wasn't legitimate. And as I said before, it wasn't just Texas, right? Other states in Mexico also revolted against or tried to revolt against Santa Anna's centralized consolidation of power, right? But you see how King George III and Santa Anna they both made similar mistakes, right? Where they did not respect the needs and concerns of the people over here in these far off territories, and so that's why and then also that also helped too. The distance as well also helped them to kind of feel like why is the London over there across the pond, like Thomas Paine in Common Sense, he talked about that, right? Why should a tiny island be telling this vast continent what to do, type of thing? So that's also another issue. But yeah, so consequences of illegitimacy obviously, of course, can create frustration, distrust, and in more extreme cases, even outright revolution. Influences of political culture. So we also see that Texas Constitution is restrictive because of the fact that Texas, pretty much for all of its as Texas became, more populated, we talked about how a lot of those Americans coming over to Texas were from the American South, so they were fans of Jeffersonian democracy, limited government, less government, more individuality, more, like I said, right, just people being left alone to do their thing and not have government intrude upon their daily lives as little as possible. And so, because of the overwhelming political culture of individualistic and traditionalistic political cultures in Texas, this is why Texas Constitution does look the way it is, where it's not, the way it's even worded is also restrictive. It's not necessarily that the Texas legislature or will do this. It's more so they're not allowed to do this. Like, you can't in Texas, like, you can't create a state income tax, right? There's state amendments that talk about that, right? It's mostly things that the state cannot do. So it's a glass half empty approach when it comes to the way that the Constitution is set up. It's not meant as a way to give more rights to government and give more power to government. Instead, we don't like that government has the power that it has already, and we're going to try to cut even more of that power, from government, right? So that's kind of a way to describe why the Texas Constitution is comprised the way it is. Okay, so let's continue also with the organizing government, right? So when we talk about the logistics of governability as well as the separation of powers here, I was referencing this earlier, right? I was referencing that especially nowadays, where government has so much responsibility. So I've taken several public administration classes, and we study this. We study how in public administration, we study how that, and I give you all an example with education right now, right? We study how that government 200 something years ago was hardly involved in people's lives, but now we see that and it's not necessarily a bad thing, so to speak. It's just that, excuse me, we as a human species have evolved over the last couple hundred years, and we've realized that humans have a lot more needs than what, not that they didn't have those needs back 200 something years ago, but we're starting to realize the needs that we have, right? Back several hundred years ago, there was no regulations when it came to like water, water treatment. That's why we had all the cholera that was going on. There was no proper sewage system. There wasn't but because of breakthroughs in science, we've learned about how, dirty water, how it can affect, people's health, right? So we see now, that's just one example, right? We see that as we've learned more as a species, we realize that there's more things that need to be regulated when it comes to ensuring people's health and people's safety. So we see that there's a lot more of this increase in government responsibility, to where now government is responsible for, um, when it comes to water standards. We're starting to see that more so now with indoor air standards too. We're starting to see that people are starting to realize that, and this is something that's rather new. I mean, not that it hasn't been a problem, but what my point is that we're starting to realize, like we also need to, just like we clean water, we also need to clean air as well. I mean, now I can understand why people might not, that might be hard for them to conceptualize, because unlike water that you can see, you can't see like what's in the air, unless of course it's like you see like tons of smog and all this and stuff and tons of haze. But if let's say you go outside, you might not know that there's, toxins in the air. So I can understand why it might be harder for people to kind of conceptualize that. But the truth is that science does say that that there is a lot of stuff in the air, and so we definitely do have to clean it. So we're starting to see that even today. We're starting to see more as the science, as we see more of the science, we also see how government also has to be responsible for more of those services, right? So that's one example. Again, like we're talking about with education, but my point is that as we see government, that's the reason why government has increased, and we have a lot more government agencies and a lot more government regulations, because now we see that there's a lot more needs that society has, especially also with society growing as large as they are. We also see more of those needs as well. And then separation of powers, of course. Again, this is the idea that, like we referenced earlier, that governments, different branches of government, different levels of government are going to have their own unique responsibilities, where, again, like the legislative branch, they're responsible for passing laws, right? The executive branch is responsible for enforcing laws. The judicial branch is responsible for interpreting laws. And you want to try to keep those powers as separate as possible. That's not to say that, presidents and governors don't engage in lawmaking, because again, they have to sign bills into law, so they are part of the lawmaking process. Uh, but the point is that they shouldn't be taking the lead on those things, right? It should be left up to the legislatures to set the tone. Now, that's not to say that that doesn't happen. That's not to say that executives don't set the tone. We see that constantly now in more recent years with presidents and governors. But the point is that in terms of the way the separation of powers was supposed to be set up, in terms of, well, not supposed, but in terms of the way it was set up originally, during, back in the U.S. Constitution days when it was being ratified, the accepted idea was that the president would take a very reactive type of role, like basically kind of just following the lead of what Congress was wanting them to do. But nowadays, of course, it's different. Right now, the president will go and put pressure on Congress. We see this during the State of the Union and things like that. Which, by the way, we do have the presidential debate coming up tonight as well. Okay, last couple things we'll talk about here, and then we'll end for today. So, necessary and proper clause. So let's probably we'll go over a couple of minutes, but this will be the last slide we'll talk about here. Necessary and proper clause, of course, also known as the elastic clause, is one of the hallmarks of American federalism. When we look at why is it that Congress has the ability to pass laws, where do they get that right to do so? It goes to the necessary and proper clause, where Congress shall make all laws that are necessary and proper. That's why it's called that. Basically, what this means here is that, so I mentioned that the U.S. Constitution is very broad, open to interpretation, not very lengthy, not very specific. It just gives very, very, it just gives kind of bullet points in terms of what government is supposed to do. And so when we see in Article 1, which is supposed to, which talks about Congress, it doesn't say specifically that Congress has to, like, I'll give you an example. Like, you're not going to find in the Constitution where it says Congress has to um, pass a law dealing with like types of firearms or something like that. You're not going to find something like that in there because that's way too specific. Instead, what you're going to find is within Article 1, Section 8, it's going to talk about that Congress is responsible for, raising an army or navy, immigration, the rule of naturalization, like we talked about, responsible for, the coining of money, so very, very, it's very bare bones in terms of what the Constitution says Congress is responsible for. It doesn't say how Congress is going to do those things. It doesn't say how you're going to come up with rule of naturalization. It doesn't say how you're going to be able to, create a military. So instead, through the necessary and proper clause, Congress is able to come up with those details through the laws that they pass. So yeah, and I'm definitely a big proponent of this because yeah, it definitely is important that you have that you have the ability for the legislative branch to do their job, where you have the ability for them to be able to pass laws related to their job description. It's kind of like a job description. Article 1, Section 8 is like Congress's job description, where, and if any of you have worked before, you know that a job description is not going to mention every single thing you have to do. It just gives a broad overview of your responsibilities. So within those responsibilities, then you have like sub responsibilities, and then you also have some leeway in terms of how to accomplish those things. Especially like if you have like a more like if you have like a more higher paying job, they give you a little bit more leeway as opposed to maybe like if you work in a factory and just okay, like do this, do that. But the point is that necessary and proper clause allows for Congress to kind of fill in the gaps and be able to adhere to those Article 1, Section 8 responsibilities. But it's not so specific. And of course, we also see this with other levels of government here as well. And then the incorporation of the Bill of Rights. What I also want to talk about here, everyone, is that the book also talks about that we see that originally the states had a lot more of this leeway during dual federalism, but with cooperative federalism now, we see that the federal government has increased in power. So we saw this when we look at the necessary and proper clause, we saw this with several Supreme Court cases like Gibbons v. Ogden, McCullough versus Maryland. Again, we don't have time to go into those. That's more so for federal government. But I want to give you all some examples of some Supreme Court cases that expanded the power of the federal government. And now we see, we also see the elasticity clause, which within the necessary and proper clause, which basically allows for Congress to basically be able to, I don't want to say pass any law that they want to because there are some limits to it, but the Congress definitely has a lot more power than what they did back in the 1700s because the Commerce Clause, to regulate commerce amongst the different states and the Indian tribes, that has been interpreted as basically meaning that almost anything can be considered commerce. So because of this allows for Congress to be able to pass laws that some people might be like, well, isn't that a state responsibility like education, or why do we have Department of Education, right? So again, I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong. I'm just explaining to you all the modern day interpretation of of Article 1, Section 8 is talking about how that Congress basically has a lot more of this power, and basically it's almost unlimited. So that's why we have where the states have kind of lost some power when it comes to the federal government. Because some people might be like, well, if Congress is passing laws, shouldn't that only deal with the federal government? Yes, technically that is true, but as I mentioned, with commerce, that now allows for the federal government to also make laws that also do affect the states here. So we're seeing that the states are that more of that power is being transferred to the federal government, and the incorporation of the Bill of Rights is also another example where this, of course, happened after the Civil War with the 14th Amendment with the due process clause, where now the Bill of Rights were now going to be incorporated to the states on a case-by-case basis. Because again, in federal government, we talk about how that originally the Bill of Rights did not impact the states. That there was a case called Barron versus Baltimore where the Supreme Court basically said that the Bill of Rights passed within, the first 10 amendments to our U.S. Constitution, that those only dealt with the federal government. So only the federal government had to abide by freedom of religion. Only the federal government had to abide by unnecessary search and seizure. So technically, that meant that the state of Texas could create their own state religion if they wanted to, under that interpretation. But of course, that went by the wayside with the 14th Amendment, where now the Bill of Rights had to be incorporated to the states, not automatically, but it had to be done on a case-by-case basis. So that's why there's a ton of, thank you very much, Supreme Court. Because of this, now Chapter 4 in federal government is so lengthy because all these Supreme Court cases I have to cover. So, they could have just said, no, it's all going to get, automatically. So, but because they didn't now we have to teach a whole bunch of these cases. But it's funny. I'm just trying to be a little funny here as we wind down here. But the point is that now it had to be done on a case by case basis, such as Gideon versus Wainwright, the right to to an attorney. Miranda versus Arizona, which allowed for the for people to know those specific rights, before they get interrogated after an arrest. All kinds of other cases, Map v. Ohio, and when it comes to the Fourth Amendment and all that stuff. So many cases I have to cover in that chapter, thanks to the Supreme Court saying that no, it's not going to be blanket, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis here. Limited government power, of course, also the legacy of colonial rule and Texas emphasis on limited power. Also, again, continuing what we were talking about here, that Texas, if you didn't know, Texas was very traditional in the way they set up their government. Again, you're definitely learning about that here. Relying on, very traditional mindsets and very traditional ways of doing business is how Texas has basically operated here. And we see this, right? We see this with the history of what Texas went through when it came to having to overthrow the Mexican government because of the lack of individual rights that Texans, the Texans were they used to have, but then they lost here. So that's another thing that's also important, is that if, let's say, you have rights and then you lose them, people are not going to be happy about that. We're seeing that right now with the in the aftermath of the Roe versus Wade overturnment a couple of years ago. People are not happy about that because of a right that they used to have and now they don't. It's definitely something that people, again, that's just my own personal observation. If people have rights and then they lose them, that's, people are not going to be happy about that. And again, continuing with the Texas emphasis on limited power here, just that going back to what we were talking about in terms of the Jeffersonian democracy mindset, that only have government come into play when it's absolutely necessary. So that also leads to why Texas doesn't have a lot of funding when it comes to government. Government in general, we don't have. That's also why Texas doesn't really have too much of a social safety net. I mean, they do, but it's not as much money as some other states, like your more moralistic states, where they tend to have more of this funding for, social welfare projects or things like that. And we'll talk more about how that also goes into. There's also some psychology to that, right? In terms of the perception, the negative perception that people might have towards, people on government assistance and things like that. But the idea is that Texas is only going to try, the fundamental idea about Texas government is that Texas is only going to intervene when they absolutely have to. That also explains why the legislature doesn't meet continuously. They only meet once every 2 years. And like I mentioned, they don't get paid that much. So again, you can see clues as to how Texas in general views the role of government and how they basically want for government to, do as little as possible here. So I think, okay, so yeah, we'll go ahead and stop here for today. Let me go ahead and stop the share here, because I know some people had to leave. So okay, so we'll go ahead and stop here for today. Let me go ahead and stop the record here.